Then we also have clinical observations. This is kind of like what we talked about in the research section. How do we gather data? Kind of the same thing here as you see this person, it looks like a teacher, right? But I'm going to pretend it's a therapist, is examining children in this setting. Naturalistic observations occur in a natural setting. Think of if I wanted to observe children's bullying behaviors, maybe I'd go to a daycare or something and just watch them through the window and make sure they can't see me. Very brief study. Analog experiments are observations in an artificial setting. So I might create a setting for the children to engage in if I wanted to observe any abnormal behavior or developmental delays, for example. Then we also have self-monitoring, which is pretty self-explanatory. People kind of check in on their own behaviors and record a frequency of a certain behavior in question. So our textbook uses the example of someone who has issues with substance abuse, kind of recording each instance where they felt the craving to engage or use a certain drug. They would write it down and keep track. The only issue there is that someone may not report it accurately, right? Maybe they don't recall it correctly, and sometimes people don't do their therapy homework. So, we have all these methods for assessing people, right? Some are better than others. So how are we going to classify these symptoms? Because we have to develop a system that we can implement on the whole and say, hey, these symptoms grouped together, this syndrome, is going to be indicative of an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder. So how do we get that together? And that's what the DSM-5 is for. It's largely used in the United States, not so much internationally. It has some issues with reliability and validity because honestly more research needs to be done, so much so to the point where the National Institute of Mental Health kind of cut funding for anything that uses solely DSM-5 criteria as kind of like their background information. So they have to use other resources to get funding, just an example. But the DSM-5 lists all these syndromes, which are just clusters of co-occurring symptoms. It's most popular in the U.S., over 500 mental disorders and criteria for diagnosing them. It gives us categorical and dimensional information, so the categories in which they fall, so an anxiety disorder, depressive disorder, a body dysmorphic disorder, a lot of those types of things. There's so many subsections that we're going to get into. But also dimensional information, which is just going to look at the severity, because some people can have mild forms of obsessive compulsive disorder and others can be quite severe. We already talked briefly about the reliability and validity, but on the whole, more research is needed. In terms of treatment, we're talking about how do we then go about treating these different disorders. We've assessed the client, we've figured out the criteria and the method through which we need to assess them. We figured out a diagnosis, and now we want to treat them. So we have that idiographic information, the person's personal information, the nomothetic information, those large universal principles of psychology, plus the clinician's theoretical orientation. And this is going to yield your treatment plan, because all those factors are going to build up on one another to produce an individualized treatment plan. There's a big push for more evidence-based treatment, and that's why we're so critical of the DSM-5 and certain therapeutic techniques, because we want to make sure there's evidence to help the person, not just kind of going with our gut like maybe Freud did in the past. So the effectiveness of treatment is really going to depend on, I like this quote from our text. What specific treatment by whom is most effective for this individual with this specific problem and under which set of circumstances? We have three main questions we're looking at with the effectiveness of treatment. Is therapy generally effective? Are particular therapies generally effective? Or are particular therapies effective for particular problems? We're getting much more specific as we move down that list. On the whole, therapy is generally very effective. People who go to therapy are 75% more likely to see an improvement in their abnormal functioning as a result of therapy. But not all therapy is built the same, right? A Rorschach ink blot assessment may lead to a different type of therapy than a cognitive behavioral approach. So we're trying to look at which particular therapies are more effective. Well, the rapprochement movement kind of looks at what are common factors for the best types of therapies. And we find that's giving good feedback to clients, helping clients focus on their own thoughts and behaviors, paying attention to client interactions with themselves, and promoting client self-mastery. It almost kind of sounds like humanistic approach, right, on the general scale, because it's very much focused on the individual and the power they had in the scenario. Now, when we get back to that third point, that with that wonderful quotation, we are looking at, are particular therapies effective for particular problems? So after we're looking at, okay, which types of therapy are most effective on the whole, we get into specifics. Which types of therapies are more effective for a particular problem? So if I'm going to measure cognitive behavioral therapy, let's say acceptance and commitment therapy, as opposed to exposure therapy for treating someone with obsessive compulsive disorder, I'm going to look at which one of those is more useful for assisting with that particular issue. I'm trying to think of another example. Trying to pull one out of my hat again. Maybe we can also look at particular therapies considering a psychopharmacological intervention. So using a drug in conjunction with some kind of therapeutic approach. Will that be more effective than just using a drug or just using therapy? So it's kind of figuring out, it's a little pragmatic, this particular question. You know, what does the evidence tell us and what is going to work for the individual? Because that's really important. Because at the end of the day, we do have individual differences that may enable some forms of therapy to be more effective for us than others. For example, for schizophrenia, drug therapy is the best intervention that we've found. And for phobias, extreme fears, cognitive behavioral therapy tends to be best. In the last slide, we're talking about what lies ahead for clinical assessment. We're looking at a renewed interest and respect for the assessment process and building that reliability, building that validity in using those systematic measures. That is really important. It kind of goes with psychology's history of, I don't want to say it this way, but kind of winging things sometimes. And so we want to make sure that we have evidence to back up our claims. We want to make sure that we are doing the best we can to figure out the diagnosis of the client so that we don't miss something, so that we're not focusing on the wrong information, and so that we can implement a proper diagnosis plan. There are concerns about funding, as our text briefly mentioned. At the time this was written, with the new, how do I want to say this? With new federal leadership, right, there is a concern about how funds will be reallocated, because some people value mental health as a part of preventative care. Some people do not. So whoever's in charge is going to allocate funds accordingly. And if they don't value mental health as a field, as a part of healthcare, then they may not want to allocate funding, if you're picking up what I'm putting down here. But healthcare priorities under the current administration are in question. Even as today, like I said previously, the National Institute of Mental Health cut funding for DSM-5, strictly DSM-5 endeavors. So you need more foundation for your research than just DSM-5 criteria, because they don't trust the validity or the reliability of it. With that being said, though, that may call the question, it calls the question different theoretical models being implemented for mental health care, kind of placing that predominance on the biological perspective that we talked about. A lot of people in the medical field focus on that biological perspective, and so there may be leaning that way in terms of research, which is not always the best because it overlooks other causes, but we're going to get there. That's all I have for this chapter. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I would be happy to help you. I hope you all have a wonderful week.